Hey people, Hohol here. Loop Hero is an indie, base-building, roguelite, character-driven deck builder. A Russian-made indie base-building, roguelite, character-driven deck builder, and since I've been, unintentionally of course, overusing Russia in my jokes, and am allergic to polonium, I want to apologize, and I promise to do better. So I made sure that the overuse of Russia in this video is completely intentional. Loop Hero began as a broken mess that was cooked up in the gulags of Ludum Dare Game Jam 45 by the studio 4 Quarters team. The theme was start with nothing, and they, in true Russian fashion, took the concept further than intended, because they ended with nothing. So it wasn't until 2 years later in 2021 that the game was actually released. You play as an unnamed, unmarked and ungendered special operations combatant who runs in a loop, fighting whatever comes in his way, mostly wildlife and geriatrics, to get resources, equipment and memory cards containing the latest drone footage of Ukraine countryside, which you have to assemble into a functional map using only your imagination. The graphics are colorful, easy to read, and remind me of RPGs from the early 90s. They don't make those like they used to. And there is also more detailed pixel art used for the dialogue with enemies and the homeless who spontaneously generate in your camp. The designs are coherent and diverse, and it's obvious that great care was taken to represent all parts of modern Russian society, including minorities from the Far East, immigrants, pedophiles and weeps. The actual hero, though, comes in 3 varieties, inspired by the 3 brothers in Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky's masterpiece Bratya Karamazovi, better known as Karamazov no Kyodai. First you have the warrior, who is based on the youngest brother, Alyosha Karamazov, the de facto protagonist of the 800-page philosophical novel that I didn't read, and the 10-page wiki article that I skimmed over. He's the simplest and only one available at the start, so it is from his point of view that we'll explore the world and encounter the so-called extreme personalities. Then there is the middle brother, Vanya, the deadliest of the Karamazovs, who is a rational atheist intellectual and struggles with the wider Russian Orthodox society. He is fittingly represented by the necromancer, who similarly struggles to fit in, often being targeted by some of the most powerful organizations in the world, like the Catholic Church, the US Armed Forces or the Viet Cong. Lastly, the rogue is based on the eldest brother, Mitya Karamazov, an indulgent man who lives life to its fullest, but without the means to sustain it. The same way the rogue cannot sustain his life points until you unlock all of the support cards necessary, and better yet, some chairs to carry his fat ass, at which point he too can live life to its fullest and becomes an unstoppable killing machine. Additionally, Loop Hero is full of symbolism relating to more recent Russian history. Its atmosphere of nothingness and abject poverty is clearly inspired by the Ukraine Holodomor of 1932. This is most noticeable in the crafting system, which gives you the option to delay your progress and spend all of your savings for the sole purpose of crafting 2 loaves of bread. On the same token, the many opaque and confusing mechanics harken back to the unpredictable use of law during the Moscow trials, and the constant threat of losing 70% of your gathered wealth upon failure with the option to grease the wheels, as they say, perfectly encapsulates the pervasive corruption of the time. Putting symbolism aside, it is my understanding that the game actually takes place in the same universe as Monster Girl Quest. This has not been confirmed by the devs, but the striking similarities in enemy types, the overarching theme of restoring the natural order and man rebelling against God, and the fact that the English wiki was taken down, yet the Russian one stayed up, are hard to ignore. I believe that they tried to cover their tracks, and that Loop Hero is secretly a sequel to Monster Girl Quest 3, which, as all true gamers know, ends with the hero Luka killing goddess Ilias. Loop Hero continues this storyline with the revelation that a god cannot truly die, and that Ilias has been reborn into Omega, who, rather than exterminating monster girls, wants to exterminate existence as a whole. Thus, the last descendant of Luka, known only as Loop Hero of the Soviet Union, the Order of Lenin, has to stop him. The majority of the game is spent on a randomly generated loop, which you populate with landmarks from your deck. These can be placed on the loop, next to it, or in the cold emptiness of space, and either provide passive buffs or spawn monsters every few days. You might ask, why do we need more enemies to fight if we want to keep the hero relatively unmolested? And this is where the scaling comes in. Every completed loop levels up both the enemies and the loot they drop, but the stats are random and often undesirable. So a steady stream of new gear is necessary to keep us rolling, and extra XP doesn't hurt. Yes, you could AFK and only kill the passively spawning slimes with very little danger to yourself, but eventually the boss will appear, and you don't want to face the boss unprepared. On the other hand, you shouldn't go overboard with dwellings before you're ready, as it tends to snowball. After all, longer loops means more time for spawns, which slows you down further, and soon every tile will be filled with 4 or 5 enemies. This careful balance is at the core of the game, and it is up to the player to optimize the deck building, land building and camp building to this end. Speaking of, let's talk about the camp. At any time, you can choose to retreat from the loop back to your base of operations with resource penalty, depending on how far away you were and your medical bill. There, you can use the gathered resources to expand and elevate your camp from a ghetto to gated community to, finally, a gated community surrounded by a ghetto. This will give you access to new cards, Karamazovs, mechanics, and inventory space to hold useful items, and the power you get from all of these things is extremely significant. As a result, the player is presented with a choice. He can either play conservatively, retreating at the slightest sign of danger to maximize resource collection and increase his raw power, or abandon all sense of self-preservation and embark on a sacred jihad against monsters, risking most of his loot, but getting deeper insight into the game mechanics, as well as a chance to beat the boss and unlock later stages, which have bigger resource multipliers to reward the increased scaling. Of course, there is always the option to simply read the wiki, like I did, and save scum at key moments, which is done by duplicating your save to one of the other slots. Though, I recommend to use this mechanic sparingly. If you simply save scum every death, you will progress too fast, as dumb as that sounds, and might end up feeling overwhelmed because you didn't have the time to actually learn the game, which later on gets pretty complicated. Many cards have hidden effects or synergies that affect the loop in unforeseen ways. Some are simple, like meadows, which bloom when placed next to another tile, or rocks, which give you HP, create goblin camps, and if clumped together, transform into mountain peaks and spawn harpies. But some are more involved, like vampires, who, when given the chance, will hire 4 crackheads to move into a nearby village, lowering the property value so that they can buy the land and build a shopping mall 3 loops later. And don't even get me started on the autism required to optimize the rivers, which has not even been solved programmatically for areas larger than 4 × 12, and only gets more complicated once you add deserts, suburbs, or, God forbid, try to account for the availability of each card. Oh, and I didn't even go into the many hidden mechanics that are never explained, like fatigue, which punishes high attack speed and evasion, or the fact that some specific buildings can only be built next to their prerequisites. If that sounds arbitrary and infuriating, that's because it is. I, for example, managed to build in such a way that the survivor's tent was blocking my warehouse, but since the survivors have successfully applied for refugee status, I couldn't just bulldoze the thing, and I had to, instead, relocate them into a very comfy mud hut. Also, some tiles are reserved for the river, so your buildings can be blocked by something that isn't even there. Really, knowledge is the most important resource in Loop Hero, but once you have a good understanding of it all, the game is actually playable with only a single hand, which is definitely a plus. On the topic of RNG, it never feels too unfair, outside of early game I guess, where you can die to an excess of environment cards or a deficiency of weapon drops, or the mid game, when a group of thieves who can apparently pickpocket by proxy skillfully snipe half of your gear, or late game. But by late game it usually doesn't matter much, and since most bad RNG won't kill you immediately, you can always retreat, which is a very nice psychological trick to make the player blame himself instead of the game. The last thing I have not explored so far are the bosses, which spawn once the little unassuming bar in the top left corner fills up and the Pokemon music starts. There are 4 in total, and I don't want to spoil the whole thing, so I'm only going to talk about the Lich, Omicron. Yes, Omicron. Being the first boss, Omicron is a literal tank and spank with a single mechanic, but one that happens outside the fight. He, like all other higher undead, requires a dwelling and will attempt to build 8 to 12 tiles of Buckingham Palace around the campfire on spawn, which increase his damage and health by up to 60%. Since no other enemy affects the environment, it is quite possible that an unsuspecting player who's still coming to grips with the game and just had a heart attack might miss this repeatedly, possibly even after he's gotten lucky and beaten him once. I might be speaking from experience here. Don't worry though, the game doesn't actually get harder after the Lich. It stays relatively consistent and in fact can even get a lot easier if you reach stage 4 and invest heavily into streetlights, which have been statistically proven to reduce crime rate up to 0 if you cover every single viable tile with 4 different lamps. At that point, enemies don't even spawn for fear of skin cancer. And while you can technically do this on stage 1, the last level has no resource limit, so with few ruins spread throughout the loop, you can leave the game running overnight and return with enough resources to fill every square of the camp with houses, and those houses with camp items. Needless to say, getting 35% free vampirism, 50% free cleave damage, and an unnaturally thick HP bar makes the game quite easy. Shalom? Bosim Shodim? Okay. I'm sorry, but I've just been informed that as a YouTube partner, I am contractually obliged to mention the secret bosses to increase my SEO, so I just did. You're welcome. On a more serious note, the secret bosses follow a rule of the harder it is to spawn, the worse it is. So this thing, which can, depending on your RNG, require over 2 million XP to spawn, is completely worthless. On the opposite end are the true creators, who are pretty reasonable to summon and basically act as the developer's self-inserts, so they got pretty interesting dialogue and complicated skills. And in the middle is the Frog King, who is a meme, because he doesn't attack, has 99% evasion and 2 HP, and in my case, 54 points of shielding. Fuck. Loop Hero is one of those rare games that are both extremely original and yet very polished. It didn't start that way, mind you. The 1.0 version was painfully slow and couldn't be saved during the run, but all of that has been fixed now. The gameplay is engaging and strategic, the story, while simple, is well told, and the progression system makes sure that anyone can eventually complete the game, and for that I give it about 46 out of 2 HP. Definitely recommend it. Before you like, share, subscribe or hate on me for ripping off another YouTuber's intro, I've got a few announcements to make. Since my Deepest Store video blew up, I created a Discord to contain all like-minded individuals. I also made a Patreon because my computer keeps threatening to explode when I render. Oh, and stop commenting in Cyrillic, please. I don't understand it, and my nickname has nothing to do with the slur. So, thank you.